Thank you for joining us. I'm Gord Long. As always, it's my pleasure to have back with me today Charles Hugh Smith, well followed and prolific writer on the web, who is the publisher of the website of twominds.com. Time once again, Charles, to exchange some ideas, which I always look forward to. Any key new thoughts in your recent writings that you want to share with our listeners before we begin?
No, I think this conversation we're going to have is my new thinking. So I'm looking forward to your um, précis of the situation, and then I'm going to propose what I think of as solutions.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it too. I think this could be one of the more important themes we've talked about in a while. I always think they're important. We wouldn't do if we didn't think so, but this one really resonates with me too. Charles, as I normally do, I need to stress with our new viewers that this is not an interview. We do these videos as a way of us productively dialoguing the important trends we are identifying and simply make our discussions available to the public for those that might be interested or want to contribute comments, which we truly and welcome and value. Today our talk is a natural follow-on from a significant amount of writings we both have been doing on truly important changes that we're all witnessing, changes that are irreversible, come with unintended consequences, and may be more disruptive to those living in Western economies than they yet fully appreciate. But there's also a lot of very positive things that come out of change that we need to appreciate too. Though they can sometimes feel negative, they can lead to very, very constructive and needed change. What we want to do today is to crystallize these changes into a salient conclusion, a conclusion we both arrived at through independent and separate analysis. I'm showing here the agenda we hope to cover with the assistance of about 27 slides on that. Any comments at all, Charles, before we begin?
No, I love your analogy of the dam breaking because that really is the case. You know, all the extremes that have been piling up for decades are now cracking, and so the dam is bursting, and we can either it's up to us how we respond to it. We can't change that extremes breaking, but we certainly control our response to it.
So what types of changes are we witnessing? What are we referring to? They are changes that on the surface may seem quite unconnected. Some might seem to affect us, others not so much. But however, when taken in aggregate, they all are showing we're moving towards a future that potentially is going to be something much different than we're all accustomed to. This list could be twice as long. They're not insignificant. The starting one here, 50-year petrodollar pillar being rejected by Saudi Arabia. That is a show in itself, the significance of that for anybody that understands how major the petrodollar implementation was in the 70s of actually fixing some of the major problems we had in the 1970s. The first European military conflict since World War II, as we experienced in Ukraine, actual killing going on that we just never seen in a Western economy since the Second World War. This week, Japan unable to defend its yield curve control and the yen crashing. I mean, we have serious new issues appearing in Japan. China aggressively threatening Taiwan. And I can go through the rest of this list and even more, but each one of these, if you scan it down, you can see our significance. But is there any commonality in here? And the answer is yes. And I'm going to initially lead here with my perspective on these changes, and I apologize if I am long-winded. I traditionally am. Before I actually turn it over to Charles for his perspective, and then we'll tie them tightly together for a conclusion. To start, I've been writing an annual thesis paper for at least the last dozen years or so, and they're normally well in excess of 100 pages of detailed research rather than just simply opinion pieces. As an aside, all these papers, videos, newsletter, research that I'm going to mention is available free at the matasi.com website, as is Charles on the of2minds.com website. But over the last 3 years, that research has led to the 3 papers that I've chosen to illustrate here that as a group show that none of the changes on the prior slide should actually be a surprise. In 2018, I wrote a paper entitled New World Order, Advancing Globalization and a Disruptive Rebalancing. In the paper, outlined a new world order. That's not a conspiracy. It was centrally about the global transition from a unipolar world dominated by the U.S. to a multipolar world where America would be an important leader but no longer had the same control over geopolitics, security, finance, culture, and other areas the U.S. has simply led since World War II and expected to till recently. Therefore, the U.S. is no longer going to be the global cop on the beat that we've all expected and turned to. And that is a big role that somebody's going to have to fill, or how it's going to be brought together and handled. Just one of the kinds of changes. But in 2019, we focused on that thesis paper on the beginnings of a shift occurring in what we referred to as de-dollarization. And let me be very, very clear here, as the title can be misleading. The U.S. dollar will be a dominant currency for years to come. However, fiat currencies like the dollar are exposed as scarcity, debt levels, unfunded social liabilities mount in the West, and contrast and appear unbalanced with other emerging powers and emerging economies. And the paper focused on the damage that was happening as the U.S. effectively weaponized its currency as a form of foreign policy tool through economic sanctions, which again, what we're doing all over again in combating Russia in the Ukraine. In 2020, we laid out the mounting global conflict that was at the doorstep of global geopolitics. We refrained from calling it, as I recall, a new Cold War era, but rather how new conflicts and destabilizing actions should be expected in what we then labeled soft militarization conflict. And they included, and I'm sure you'll recognize some of this, cyber attacks and security, pandemics and what we call genetic intrusions, controlled media narrative, economic alliances and trade regulations, mass refugee movements based on war, climate change, or economic instability. And all of these kinds of things flow that was a logical consequence, which we've arrived at right now. Charles, any comments on anything I mentioned so far?
No, I think those papers tie directly, as you say, into our discussion today. And I've certainly learned a lot by reviewing your work in all the years we've been recording.
It's been a few years, right? So what all this meant was that the controlling role of the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency and the U.S. Treasury paper debt, as reflected in the 10 years specifically, as the global risk-free benchmark would change. Again, I'm not saying it is ending, not at all, but rather is becoming and will become less dominant. And it's at the margin that is profound. The slightest changes as it's happening are a big deal. And it will continue to happen and accelerate, though the dollar and the 10-year U.S. Treasury will be around for quite some time, no question about that. What we're now witnessing, Charles, and as you mentioned, this dam we've used as a theme here, is cracks in the dam that has kept the world unusually stable for nearly 80 years. And historically, that's a very long time without major societal or power upheavals. The dam that is breaking is that of a unipolar world, which I'm showing here as the dam, dominated by the U.S. The cracks in that dam can be seen by the crumbling bedrock stabilization pillars that dam is built on, and there are quite a number of them. But for example, the petrodollar I mentioned, recently being rejected by Saudi Arabia, has profound importance. The slowing foreign buying of U.S. debt that's been going on for 2 years now, and who is going to buy it at the increasing levels it has to be bought and at what rate. The diminishing need for U.S. dollars themselves simply to conduct foreign trade, because the U.S. isn't the biggest exporter that it once was as an industrialized nation. The dollars aren't as required anymore and have to come home as claims, and therefore pushes inflation. Those are consequences. So what the dam is holding back, though, and maybe the most important in this illustration, are high levels of poor U.S. performance. Specifically, that for 40 years, the U.S. has consistently consumed more than it produces while living beyond its economic means. And that fact is being shown in the everyday twin deficits that we have, current accounts, national debt, unfunded liability, and the true fiscal gap which includes contingent liabilities. This is a huge high level of water that's now being forced through this cracks. And the water spewing from the breach in a dam is now evident in surging hard assets such as commodities and precious metals. The fact that it is in hard assets really begs the question of paper assets versus hard assets, and where true collateral exists in the whole lending process that people don't really fully appreciate. And that's at the root of it. And what everybody seems to have lost view of, Charles, in my mind, is that wealth can only be created by growing it, mining it, or building it. It can't be created by printing it. Paper is only an IOU, a credit, a demand note. It isn't wealth until it is actually honored for real wealth. I recently laid out in 2 videos how central commodities have become to this emerging new world. I also laid out in 2 supporting newsletters how energy has assumed a geopolitical role not seen since the 1970s with the forced adoption, as I mentioned, about the petrodollar, and additionally how U.S. energy dependence is again crippling the nation as it also did in the 70s. So what we forget is industrialized nations can only produce based on the availability and cost of energy, as well as the cost and availability of raw materials in the form of commodities, including soft commodities such as food. And these are becoming scarcer on a per capita basis, and both are now dominated. And this is really, Charles, a key point to me, that both are now dominated and controlled by non-Western economies such as China, Russia, the aligned BRIC partners, accords such as the Shanghai Agreement, Belt and Road Initiative of China, and the African Commodity Agreements by China. These elements are no longer within a Western economy's total control, and the shortages and scarcities for various reasons that can appear are profound. So what does all this mean, Charles? To me, it's about coming scarcities and the abilities to create wealth per capita. And that is, for decades, finance and financialization, and you've written about it extensively, has dominated resources, or these commodities, hard assets. In the future, resources will dominate finance. It'll be the other way around, and that's what's happening here. The change it will bring is not all necessarily bad, as I've mentioned. That is something to remember and embrace. And so, Charles, sorry for being a little long-winded, but that's what I see. So do you want to talk about the good news that may come from some of these changes, or any questions you had in anything I said?
Well, Gordon, I think you. I just want to emphasize a couple points that you've posted here in your previous papers that you've just released in the last month or so. One was, I think, very important, and I just want to mention it for emphasis, is the U.S. Energy dependency debacle, which is the political decision that climate change is more important than domestic energy, right? And the problem there is that everybody wants to move to non-hydrocarbon energy sources, right? Solar and wind and so on. But they want to end the extraction of hydrocarbons before we've actually built the alternative source of energy we need. In other words, solar and wind are like 5% of our energy consumption, and yet we're going to end, hydrocarbon extraction. No. First, if you want to end hydrocarbon use, you're going to have to build an alternative system that provides something on the order of, say, 75 or 80% replacement of hydrocarbons. And yet, so we have it backwards. Like we want to end hydrocarbon use before we have an alternative source of electricity and so on. So that doesn't make any sense. And that political decision is costing us, and it will cost us dearly going forward. So and your paper, I recommend everybody look it up and read it, because it lays it out very clearly. And I just want to mention too, just for context, we have to remember that in World War II, the United States provided literally 3/4 of all the oil used in the World War II era. In other words, we were the combined Saudi Arabia, Mideast of the world. And then in the late 60s and the 70s, what happened is our ability to produce most of the oil in the world declined, right? And so that created an oil shock and put the U.S. economy in the 70s through a very wrenching transition where we could no longer waste all of the energy that we did because we were no longer able to provide it ourselves. So this is when, automobiles in the U.S. went from 12 miles per gallon to like 25 and on their way to, even higher. And there were a huge wrenching transitions in pollution controls and industrial efficiencies. And so in other words, energy shocks are actually a positive. They feel really bad in the moment, but what they do is they force the economy to go through a transition to much higher efficiency and much higher productivity. And that's kind of what you and I are foreseeing here, is that the world is changing, and a lot of people are going to go, oh gosh, that means it's bad. Change is bad. No, change is good, because it's going to force us into an economy that's much more productive, much more efficient, and much more sustainable. Because what we have now is unsustainable and unstable. And when your metaphor of the dam is, to me, perfect, because the situation now is fundamentally, structurally unstable. It cannot go on, right? And so it's unsustainable. So something has to change, and we can either choose a positive path or we can let the current system collapse, and that's a bad choice.
Let's hope we make the right choices here. And I point to our political leadership around the world. Do they rise to the challenge of some of these changes that need to happen, Charles?
Right. And so my latest book is called Global Crisis, National Renewal, a Revolutionary Grand Strategy for the United States. And I put the word revolutionary in brackets because I didn't want people to think I was calling for a Marxist revolution. But I was speaking more about the kind of revolution in the economic structure that I was just describing in the 70s. In other words, we need to remake our economy to become sustainable and efficient and much more self-supporting. If not entirely independent, less dependent on all these, as you say, external sources of essentials. And so the global crisis that I refer to is exactly what you've described. The dam is breaking. The national renewal is a way of taking this change as an opportunity. And so one of my points is, it's just not going to be possible to replace hydrocarbons with solar and wind and so on for a lot of different reasons. We need to make efforts in that regard, but it's not going to be a seamless transition. And so what that means is the consumer-based global economy is obsolete without cheap, abundant energy. In other words, the whole global economy is what I call waste is growth. It's a landfill economy where the more we waste, the higher the GDP, and the faster we make things break down so they have to be replaced, and the faster we dump stuff in the landfill, the greater the GDP, and that's the economy we have. It's the most perverse incentive system one could imagine. And so we need to accept the fact that's not sustainable anymore. We no longer have enough resources to waste 40% of everything. And so we're going to have to transition to what I call a degrowth economy that's based on radical increases in efficiency and durability. And all this engineering is well understood. There's one particular engineer, Amory Lovins, who's been working on this thing for 30 or 40 years at Stanford and at the Rocky Mountain Institute. And so he lives in a house that requires no heating, no energy at all in winter. It's at 7,000 feet elevation. He grows bananas in his house, in his greenhouse. He designed a 300 mile per gallon vehicle like 30 years ago. And many other people have worked on these same things. There just hasn't been the incentive structure to support this kind of radical improvement in efficiency. But I think what we're talking about is this is what's going to happen. Now, I also talk about the national renewal of reshoring of supply chains and understanding that our dependency on essentials such as energy and metals and minerals from places far overseas that are not within our control, that's a threat to our national security. And so, rather than try to, as you say, police the world, like kind of try to recreate a colonial world where we control all the resources, that world is gone. And no one is going to be able to do that, and no one should be able to do that. Every country should be able to price its resources and products and services on an open, transparent market. That's the ideal. So we have to realize that if we don't control the sources of our essentials, we're going to have to do a much better job of using the resources we have much more efficiently. And so that, I think, is potentially a huge possibility for growth. In other words, growth not of the GDP, but growth of productivity and efficiency. And there's going to be wealth lost as for those that cling to the waste is growth landfill economy model. Those nations that do that are going to destabilize and collapse because that model is not sustainable. Those countries that go for degrowth, this new efficient model of sustainability, they're going to survive and thrive. And so what I mean by degrowth, a lot of people think degrowth means, we're going to all have to live in wear hair shirts and live in cardboard boxes or something. No, it just means eliminating unproductive waste, friction, fraud, and speculative skimming, right? Instead of investing in stock buybacks and essentially worthless financialization, we would invest our capital in becoming much more efficient. And we have to remember that there's tremendous potential here that we've sort of lost sight of, that the productivity increases in the Western world, the developed world, and even now more recently in China are on the order of 1 or 2% a year. That is trivial. I mean, we used to be able to improve productivity by 10% a year. And it's because we've lost sight of the need to increase productivity. We've played financial games as a way of masking the fact that we've lost our ability to improve productivity at the rate we need to, right? And the other thing is central planning doesn't work, by any model. You can call it totalitarian, you can call it communist, you can call it, democracy, you can call it anything you want, but if you're trying to create solutions that are all from the top down, they don't work. So we need to decentralize capital and control of resources and problem solving to the local levels, cities, counties, states. The lower you push the control, the more problems you can solve much more quickly, right? And we need to greatly increase the controls of shoddy products. I mean, we all know, I just replaced a water heater, US made. It only lasted 9 years before it started leaking. In the past 20 years, I've replaced many water heaters that were 40 years old and still functioning fine. So it's like we've lost track of just how poorly made so much of our products are, and also the poor quality of our services. I don't have to say anything about that. We all know that. And then, so what we're talking about here, Gordon, as a solution is deglobalizing and definancializing, because globalization has reached extremes that have now put our national security at risk. And we're not the only nation at risk. Every nation's at risk and being dependent on somebody else for their essentials. And then financialization has created more problems than it's solved. It's created the illusion of solutions, like that, as you say, we can print our way to prosperity. But that's created a very fragile, unstable financial system, which, as you say, is now breaking down. So we can't rely on the financial trickery anymore. We're going to have to actually change the way we live in the real world. And that means getting rid of the dominance of financialization. And so I think that this is an opportunity to go through on a larger scale what the developed world went through in the 70s. And I'm going to let you talk about what happened in the 70s, Gordon. We were both alive then, but you were really in the tech world and working with major corporations. And what I think people have lost track of was it was we call it a lost decade of stagflation, but that really wasn't what was happening. Was the U.S. economy was being transformed at the fundamental level of production to become much more efficient.
I was implementing mainframes, for those who know what that is, for the IBM Corporation, and trying to get major corporations to install something new called a computer on a large scale. A multi-million-dollar investment, and the boards that we were presenting to were more concerned of staying alive. They were fighting inflation and problems that they had never experienced before. It was a very, very, very tough time. But when we did get out of the 70s, we experienced some of the best 40 years this country's ever had, because we also made a lot of very, very fundamental changes. Some good, a lot, mostly good, but some of them are now being called into question because they weren't sustainable, but we came out of it. Charles, it's really resetting what we think about capitalism. And that is, when you understand what capitalism is fundamentally about, it's about taking savings and taking that savings and that they're invested into productive assets that create wealth for people. And what they do, how they do that is those productive assets make us more productive. And the more productive we are, that includes getting rid of waste and everything, the more productive we are, the higher our living standards become. And that's what we're fighting at. But what we've moved to is no longer, one, we don't have savings. We live on credit. We create money, if we would, and debt. So what's happening is that I refer to it many times as creditism, but what's happened instead of capitalism is now what happens is we take that credit versus savings that we're creating, and we invest it, but we don't invest it in productive assets. We invest it into consumption, and we consume it. And it's not something that will produce anything, it's consumed. We live in a 70% consumption economy. That in itself is not sustainable. When you have that and it's not going into productive growth, minimizing waste, etc., matter of fact, creating waste by the nature of what consumption is, it lends itself to more landfills. But when you do that, your standard of, what most important, you don't have the productivity and your standard of living falls. That's why it's really important that we reset here, or we're going to be in a sustaining falling standard of living. That is not something anybody wants in the world. What we want is a world rising standard of living for everybody. And because everything we seem to do today is to cut costs, cut labor, cut this. Where are we investing in the new growth and the new strategies and the new world? Sure, there are some, but there aren't as many as there needs to be. You know, you look around America, what built America? It was the Carnegies building railroad, or bridges rather, and steel. And the Rockefellers inventing the oil industry, inventing it. The Vanderbilts creating railroads and shipping. Edison creating electricity. It's not like innovation has changed. It's being forced on new and productive innovation. And we went into just manipulating financial numbers. And the last point I make here too, Charles, is degrowth. We don't really have growth. I wrote a long paper quite a number of years ago, though actually our economic GDP formula is terribly flawed. It's something that's fundamentally archaic. Because, for example, just one of the many is the big part of the formula those are familiar with is government. Government spending is the G that goes in. The bigger the government spending, the higher the GDP in a country. Well, in our case, the GDP, the government spending, they take it and it's transfer payments that they pass to the public for various social programs, etc., that is spent as consumption. So then that money is again credited back into the GDP formula for C, that is consumption. But it's worse than that, because the money is borrowed. So when we borrow it, that's called investment, and it's called I in the formula, and we add it in. So we're just adding all these numbers up that is just increasing debt. And that is what fosters this bad capitalist kind of structure. Then we take the GDP and we say, oh, no, no, you got to factor in inflation, call it a deflator, and we take it down by 2%. And now all of us know inflation 7, 8, and some people say that that inflation is actually as shadow stats 15% if you were to do it based on a 1980 basis. So our game is creating wrong incentives, wrong structures that has to be reset in a positive and solid fashion. The conclusions, Charles, you want to take a stab at them here on this slide I have?
We're now entering a multipolar world that means change on multiple levels, right? Energy, resources, finance, geopolitics, and the political order within each of our countries, our domestic economy and our domestic political and social scene. And it means a new world order, which can mean a lot of different possibilities and not all negative, right? I mean, we can cooperate, and find areas to cooperate in. The U.S. is not necessarily the cop on the beat. In other words, we no longer are going to have the resources or gains of wars of choice and trying to recreate a colonial environment. And then there's conflict of cultures, major differences that will be difficult to resolve. And we have to face this straight up. We're not all going to agree on everything, but we need to find the areas that we can agree to work together on. And scarcity becomes the central driver. And I want to emphasize that what I see is a lot of magical thinking. And I know people don't like to be told, hey, that's magical thinking. But, people are hoping that fusion energy will replace all the hydrocarbon energy and so on. But these things take decades, and we don't have decades. And so we're going to have to respond in a much more aggressive fashion and changing, not just looking at energy, but also, as you said, the metrics we use to differentiate well-being from consumption, for example. We want to seek well-being, not just more consumption. That model is unsustainable. So, so I think my summary is, if you look at systems, which is what we need to do, we need to look at the global economy and our own economy as a system. If you can develop what we call in systems language an island of coherence. In other words, if you can get a system that actually works well, is productive, is adaptive, is flexible, and increasing productivity, people and nations are going to start coalescing around you in a positive way. In other words, when you get a model that works, everybody's interested. And when you cling to a model that's broken and unraveling, then everyone's going to want to run away because that's not working. So my whole point here is we need to become an island of coherence. If we can become efficient and decentralized, flexible, and increase our productivity by increasing our efficiency, other nations and companies will start glomming onto this model and start copying us. And then that will be better for the world as a whole.
Charles, in wrapping, you mentioned earlier about me being back in the 70s, and I apologize for those, but the really common thing we used to say and use, and some maybe not, younger group may not be familiar with it, was the Chinese symbol of a crisis. And the crisis, that symbol for crisis, had two symbols that overlapped. One was the symbol of danger, and the other was the symbol of opportunity. And that's how it has to be looked at right now. Danger and opportunity, but this is what happens with the crisis and change. Change is trying to happen. We need to endorse it and put our arms around it and help make it happen. And hopefully, and as I kind of led to earlier, hopefully we have the leadership in the world, political, social, all levels of leadership that can rise up. And I have every confidence that maybe not in the leadership, because it always changes, but I do in people. And I believe everybody wants the best for their families, their children, their friends, their communities. And the closer we get to that, and I see it in my community, I see people when it's getting a little tough, people out helping other people, trying to help other businesses. And that's the kind of change that I'm beginning to see even here at the local level. So, any closing comments you have as we wrap here, Charles? I guess we're up against our hard line.
Yeah, no, I really value that your presentation, Gordon, and I want people to take away the fact that clinging to the old model, waste is growth, landfill economy, that's not really an option. That's unsustainable, and it's destabilizing our economy and the global economy. And so we're going to have to respond more positively, and it's not that difficult. It's not that difficult to see a better way of living ahead, and that we just have to devote our capital and labor to that vision rather than try to cling on to what's no longer working.
Charles, thank you very much for the time. As I do, I always enjoy these times for us to get together and compare ideas. So, talk to you in another month or so.
Thank you very much, Gordon.
Talk to you. Bye.